Okay, well, let's kick off. So hello, thank you all for joining our webinar today, Compliance Data Analytics with Impact, Real World Insights. We're going to be discussing today concrete ways to use advanced transaction monitoring of expenses and third-party payments to make sure your compliance program is as effective as it can be, while also producing hopefully wide-ranging positive impact throughout your organization. And we're going to talk about how to start that journey from start to finish and all the steps along the way. So with that, I'm honored to have with me today three true experts in this space. First, Tarek Helu, who's a partner at Wilson Sonsini, Goodrich, and Rosati, and who's a former assistant chief of the FCPA unit at the U.S. Department of Justice. Next, we have Melissa Kashuk, who leads compliance operations and ERM in the governance, risk, and compliance function of Olympus Corporation of the Americas. And finally, last but not least, Keith Thomas, lead counsel, corporate integrity and compliance at FedEx Corporation. So welcome to all of you, and thank you for participating in this webinar. I'm Parth Chanda. I'm the founder and CEO of Lextegrity. I'm a former in-house compliance counsel, spent about a decade in-house at Pfizer and Avon, and founded Lextegrity in 2017 to create better compliance data analytics and workflow software that I wish I had when I was in-house. So it's a pleasure being here with all of you today. So a few housekeeping items before we kick off. Please feel free to submit any questions in the question section of the GoToWebinar console. I'll be watching that. I can interrupt the presentation to ask questions. We're going to try to cover a lot of information today. If we don't get a chance to answer your question, we'll follow up with you afterwards as well. You'll receive a survey at the end of the webinar. If you have an opportunity to fill that out, that would be great. Any feedback's always appreciated. And then just as a disclaimer for all four of us, any and all views that we express today are our own, don't reflect the views of any current or previous employer. So with that, I'm going to kick it off, and we'll start with you, Tarek. As a former senior DOJ official and now white collar partner who advises companies for a living every day, how do you think about the need for organizations to put into place compliance, transaction monitoring, compliance analytics, and in your mind, what does good look like in this space?
Yeah, so there are two main reasons for it. The first, you can help your program and ultimately save money. And second, the government expects you to do it now. And if you're under investigation, you're in a much better position from the get-go if you've got a good system for using and managing your data. Now, let me answer each of those in turn. To improve your program, one thing, if you use your data, you can identify your risks more quickly and more accurately, and then you can spend the money that you have for compliance the right way. And we're going to talk in a little bit about making a business case internally and how to deal with limited budgets, but you want to focus on your risk areas. It can also help you improve your business performance. And it's not just risk reduction, but for example, using your data, you can onboard third parties faster. You can approve gifts, meals, and entertainment requests faster. That keeps the business side and the sales side happy. They understand that you're there to work with them, not just to ensure that the rules are followed, but you want to work with them to get them to the point they need to be at and to accomplish their goals. You can also reduce the number of third parties or other vendors that you use and get better prices. You can look at parts of your business where you're spending too much, maybe not spending enough, and adjust that. The second reason is, as I said, the government now expects it. They've been focusing on using data since about 2016, and they've included using data in their recent updates to the evaluation of corporate compliance programs, which is a document that's publicly available that explains how they look at companies' compliance programs when they're under investigation. And the DOJ themselves, they're using data more. Other units in the fraud section where the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act unit is housed have been using data for years. The healthcare fraud unit has access to essentially all of Medicare and Medicaid data. The market integrity and major fraud unit has access to a lot of trading data, which they can use for insider trading cases. The FCPA unit now is using data more. They recently hired a data management expert. They're scraping SEC filings to get information on public tenders in high-risk countries and how companies use third parties for sales. They're also looking at suspicious activity reports, which are reports that financial institutions are required to file when there's any transaction that looks like there may be some criminal activity. So they're going to use data more, and they're going to expect you to use it more. They're going to expect you to use it to create and implement your program and also to run your business.
Great, thank you. Really wide-ranging, comprehensive response. Keith and Melissa, I'd love to turn it over to you from an in-house perspective, how you think about the use of data analytics.
Yeah, for me, we've simply evolved to a point in the compliance world where we cannot effectively do our job without looking at data, analyzing data, and making decisions based on data. 10 years ago, yes, you still looked at data and stuff, but you could manage it in Excel or whatnot, and you were really just tending to look at key metrics and whatnot. But now, both, I think, not only just the government, but I think shareholders, the board, executives, even customers and employees are going to want to know that you're taking risk into account, that you are acting responsibly, and that you are making decisions that are well informed and not just based on your gut or whatever. And so to do that and to do it well, you really have to analyze the data that you have. You can't just have this treasure trove of data and then just do nothing with it. That's not going to fly with all those groups that I mentioned. And so with respect to the DOJ, the SEC, and the enforcement agency, thankfully, I've had the good fortune of working for a lot of companies that don't find themselves regularly in trouble with those agencies. But that doesn't mean that we can just ignore what those expectations are, because I think a lot of the companies that find themselves before those agencies also thought they were never going to be there. And so we take those expectations, and that's primarily what we use to help us build that business case internally of saying, to the board or our executives or anyone else who might be looking at, this analytics is just another cost. Why should I do this? Is we can say, look, not only could we find ourselves here, we can't ever be so relaxed in ourselves and so confident in ourselves that we would say, oh, we would never be here, because we don't know what's going to happen all over the world. But this is the expectation that the government is going to have. And if we don't meet that and then find ourselves in that position, we're going to be looking back as to who made that decision not to go forward and not to build out this analytics program. And you don't want, I don't want to be in the position of saying, yeah, well, that was me, and you don't either. So it's also been a very effective tool for us to help educate our board, educate our executives, and educate those who might be looking at it as purely an excess cost that really doesn't deserve attention. Is using those guidelines to just educate about analytics generally, not just what the DOJ or the SEC is expecting, but just the whole concept of using them like we've been talking about.
Thank you, Melissa.
Sure, and from my perspective, I joined a compliance function about 10 years ago. And prior to that, I was in audit. And so we generally did use data analytics to find indicators of, is the control operating as we intended? In joining the compliance department and looking at the monitoring and testing program, we started some very basic stuff. And I'm so glad we did, because we entered into several agreements with the government in 2016. And we did find just how important not only was it for us to start it, but was for the government and our monitor to identify that we had started an analytics routine and program, and we were looking for those anomalies, and then we were handing it off to the testing and monitoring team. While it started that way, as we've evolved, it really was a way where a couple things, we could learn more about our business. And so the people in our compliance team are learning more about what's happening in our business, what transactions are we entering into. And so that then opens up, well, what about, and then that kind of, those ideas really take hold as to improving the whole program. We also, we're a lean team in the compliance department in the Americas. And so I would not be able to get the coverage in our monitoring and testing program without the use of analytics. Also, I think we also, from a retention of capabilities and human resources, when individuals are having the technology send them the anomalies where they can look into, they're looking at it, it's not wasting their time. They're looking at some interesting things, and there's a growth opportunity for them too. And we get much better coverage than we could if we were doing this manually.
Oh, thank you. That's really helpful. So maybe tying together some of the threads that all of you have raised, I think the government expectations are on one side of the equation, but I think often the enforcement agencies, the DOJ, SEC, AFA, et cetera, they're often kind of trailing indicators from my experience of what compliance programs need to be doing to ensure that they're effective. You saw it in the third party due diligence space probably 15 years ago. Leading companies started doing more in that space, and then it started appearing in DOJ settlements and then kind of de facto became a requirement for companies to be putting those types of programs into place. I think we're in the same moment over the last 5 years or so with compliance monitoring, transaction monitoring, data analytics, where leading companies who've been in front of the government have invested, showed them what's possible, and then you get Kenneth Polite last year as the former head of the criminal division saying at Compliance Week that in his mind an effective compliance program, or the analysis that he does on a company, is that they're training employees and empowering them to do the right thing, but then immediately detecting issues if any employee does the wrong thing. And so not relying just on your hotline to find something out, months later or after the issu's already spread, but really much more real time. And so, leading companies like Olympus Americas, FedEx, they've known this for many years. But I think the government's now kind of pulling everyone else up and along on that journey. So, from my experience, in my prior life as outside counsel, and then at Pfizer and Avon, where we were involved in both of those companies' investigations, and now working with Lextegrity, where we've worked on, helping resolve 2 different monitorships, securing a DOJ declination. I can say, definitively that I've seen the impact that those companies having a transaction monitoring program, a transaction monitoring tool, that's been a key element in the outcome. So, I think what we're going to talk about a little bit now, just switching gears, is diving a little bit deeper in terms of what that actually means in terms of advanced analytics and expense monitoring, in third-party customer payment, customer revenue transactions, what that actually looks like. So maybe I'll turn it over to you, Melissa, first to provide a little bit of color in terms of how you're managing expense monitoring. In full transparency, Melissa and Keith are customers of Lextegrity, but I think they're going to share insights, about our tool, but much more broadly beyond that to their overall approach. So Melissa, turn it over to you.
Thanks, Parth. So when we started the expense monitoring program, we didn't make a huge investment, and we'll talk about getting the budget for the analytics program. But we started with Excel and reports out of the SAP Concur system, and then we moved into using ACL and then some visualizations. And we were finding we were getting better coverage. We were looking at 100% of the expense population, and we were finding policy violations, which were then being fed to internal investigations. We found that moving to something like Lextegrity, software as a service, allows the in-house data analysts to focus on building the routines for those things that are really unique to our business, really unique to our transaction set. But those type of commodities of expense reporting, leveraging the benefits that a tool and that advanced tool can bring, like Lextegrity and the expense reporting, has been super helpful. When we were considering this, we thought, oh, well, we'll get the upgrades and we'll get the enhancements and so on and so forth. And that was a big sell for us. But what it else did was it gave us the basics we were looking at. We were looking at meals with healthcare professionals over the limits. We were looking at split checks. Yes, we got that. But then we were getting some risk insights to things we had never thought about. Why? And the questions started happening with some, very inquisitive individuals on our monitoring and testing team. Why are people using their credit card to buy this, this, and this? And there were two things there. Maybe it was not appropriate for the purchase, but also if there were that many, there would have been cost savings from going with an approved supplier for things. And so we also saw this as the insights coming from this, not only from a negative, but a positive, to go back to the business and say, do you know this? Look at how many transactions have occurred. We're also looking, this is allowing us to look at areas that we had not thought of. If we were using Excel or ACL, we wouldn't find it in the same way. We're finding transactions which are essentially bypassing the processes, right? And so we're able to quickly react to those and identify them, and then get communications out to the business to say, we've identified this, we're watching. And in fact, someone just said to me the other day, they're talking with an individual and they said, how did you know? Are you looking for these things? And we're like, yes, we are. And so the expense reporting, I think, also gives you a smarter way to look at your dashboard and the transactions you're seeing. We're able to throttle from risk indicators on what we want individuals to look at. So we're making most efficient use of their time. And we're also able to tune the system as we see changes or we learn a little more. We're able to write our own custom rules, which has really, really made a super impact on improving our program.
Oh, thanks, Melissa. And I think with the COVID era and work from home, I think there was a shift of focus away from travel and entertainment expenses, which I think obviously is changing a bit. But also, look, enforcement is still very active in this space. I think the most recent Clear Channel settlement involved, hundreds of thousands of dollars in travel, hotels, meals, etc. So, I think using analytics, your Concur system may flag a violation of a policy or a limit, but using data analytics to look at anomalies over the broader data set for patterns for a specific employee or a specific type of expense, I think using analytics the way you're using it's definitely the most effective route that we've seen. So no, thanks for sharing that. On the vendor side, maybe I'll kick it off and I'll turn it over to you, Keith, because you all are a little bit earlier in the journey. I think the approach is really similar to what Melissa laid out. It's really taking in that data, in this case from your ERP system, whether it's on the vendor or supplier side, on the procure to pay side, or on your customer revenue transactions on the order to cash side, which would be looking at things like distributors, their rebates, chargebacks, free goods, etc. And then applying again those multiple key risk indicators, custom risk rules, etc. that are really targeted to your business to escalate up aggregated risk score transactions to identify the highest risk transactions for follow-up. I think it's important. One thing that we really emphasize to companies that we work with is it's important to look beyond just the payment data, but to look at purchase requisition, to purchase order, to invoice, to payment, and join all that data together, because you can really unlock a lot of information when you compare those elements as well. And so, when you can do that on a continuous basis, and as Melissa explained, continue to fine tune and customize your analytics on an ongoing basis, you kind of get to the same results. So Keith, you all are starting this process right now. I'd love to hear your perspectives on why the FedEx compliance team is going in that direction, kind of where you're going from and where you hope to go to.
Well, you stole my thunder a little bit, but it's okay. It's okay. No, when talking about data anomalies, because what we started with was very, very similar to Missy's. We were doing a control self-monitoring, and we implemented, it was largely based in Excel, and we would just do spot checking basically of some of our vendor transaction payments. but there really wasn't a, it was more just random selection of, hey, here's, 10 payments, review them to make sure that they comply, or here's 20 payments, whatever, and make sure there's nothing wrong with them. And it took about 2 cycles of that to realize that that was not going to be an effective way of managing the thousands and thousands and thousands of payments that FedEx makes to vendors all over the world, every single day. Because it wasn't based on risk. It was just based on largely random selection and doing some spot checking. So that was quickly abandoned, and we started looking at other options. Lextegrity came on our radar, and we're like, this is exactly what we need. Because, like you said, you mentioned Concur for expenses. We have another platform that analyzes payments as they're going out the door, but it's a rules based. It's completely, here's the FedEx policy, make sure it complies with the policy. And if it does, great. But it doesn't take that data and then compare it to other payments to that same vendor over time. It doesn't look for anomalies based on payments in relation to other vendors of a similar nature. It doesn't look for, compare the profile information of that vendor and then compare, is this matching, and look at payments over time and the size of payments. And the reason that's important is we've had situations in the past where, as Missy said, people go around the process. They know how to game the system a little bit. And so you may have a situation where somebody is in league with a vendor and all of their invoices are under a particular threshold and they all meet the policy, so to speak. But then when you look at them together as a whole, you realize there's a problem here. This is not a legitimate transaction, not a legitimate situation. And so that's what really attracted us to the Lextegrity model. Is it's looking at all of the information, not just a single transaction in its little thing, but it's looking at it, all the transactions in context, and then comparing them using the machine learning and advanced algorithms to then look for data anomalies that we can go, all right, what's going on here? Why is this over here? And like Missy said, ask those questions. What is happening? Why is it happening? Where is it happening? Those types of things that can dig a little bit deeper behind the scenes, and hopefully, I would say, stop the bleeding if you find these transactions. So it's not just about catching the bad guys or doing what's right or wrong. There's an actual dollar cost to it in terms of avoiding future loss, avoiding future fraud, avoiding future corruption, avoiding future penalties. It's hard to quantify that dollar amount, but it's there. And that's what we really are looking forward to using. We hopefully will have it fully implemented very soon. We're excited. I'm ready. I've been chomping at the bit. We're just working through the technical side of getting everything aligned, but I'm ready to start working on the program soon.
Right, and we're going to talk a little bit in 2 minutes about building that budget case and the business case internally. But Tarek, let you have the final word on this as someone who I'm sure is advising companies as they're thinking about the next phase of this. Kind of how do you help them think through some of the questions that approaches that Missy and Keith laid out?
Yeah, and you can use it for expense monitoring. It's very helpful. It's also very helpful for your third-party management process. And if you break that down, you've got due diligence, onboarding, and then monitoring once you sign them up. For due diligence, you can use your data, how much you think based on your past, this third party you're going to spend on them, what revenues you think you'll bring in, those will increase your risk, what their function is. Do they interact with the government? You could also integrate outside data like Transparency International's index or Trace's country risk scores to help that implement it like a due diligence process where you can effectively determine, okay, what do we have to do in monitoring? The next step with onboarding, one easy thing you can do with your data and integration is to connect that due diligence number to your vendor management system. So for example, they can't move forward until all the due diligence steps have been completed. And then very importantly, monitoring. You can use your data to identify anomalies between either a third party's past tendencies or what it's doing and what similar third parties are doing. For example, is there a significant fluctuation in spending or revenue? They have a high occurrence of round transactions or consecutive invoices. Are there you seeing an evidence of duplicate invoices or something that could be good or bad? Large increases in activity near the end of the month, quarter, or year end, and that goes a little beyond even FCPA compliance and into potential revenue recognition issues. You can compare payments to your third parties by the product, by the service, or other fees. Are there changes? And as you get more complicated, you can do more risk scoring. You can analyze each payment by the type of the third party, the description, the trends, and the account. So there's a lot you can do with expense management and also with third parties and in other areas.
Oh, that's really great. And I like you honing in on that specific concrete example, particularly in light of the new safe harbor guidance that's come out
Yes.
from the DOJ. That's kind of 6-month safe harbor in the kind of acquisition target context. I think this is going to really open up a lot more use of data analytics because you've got a population of third parties that are coming in where, the due diligence you mentioned, the kind of due diligence and onboarding may have been of a different quality, let's say, than the due diligence and onboarding you're doing as a company, as an acquirer. And so how do you get to the answer really quickly without, manually going through every single one of those parties and interviewing people and figuring out what they're doing and what their actual risk is? You could start that whole process with data. So like you talk about, this cycle, but it almost is like a feedback loop where you could analyze the data and then kind of siphon off the parties and the scrutiny that you do and the enhanced due diligence that you do. Have you seen, actually, I'm curious, have you seen any companies start to talk about that, taking that approach of using the data analytics more quickly as they're thinking about their kind of third-party population that they're going to be inheriting in that acquisition context?
I have heard of that, and it is important that, when you're in an M&A deal, you have a limited amount of information before the deal closes. And obviously you can get representations and warranties, you can do some questioning of the other side, and you'll get some data, but the amount that you get really is limited. And then once the deal closes, you may have some recourse if there's an issue, you may have some kind of holdback, but the best thing is to get in there and quickly do your post-acquisition integration and post-acquisition due diligence. And using your data there is just as important, if not more important, than using your data to run your own program. Because like Parth said, you don't know for sure what they have done in terms of bringing in their third parties. And everyone on this call knows this, but about a half of all FCPA cases involve bribes paid through third parties.
Yeah, definitely. So great. All right. So with that, Keith, I'm going to pull on the thread that you brought up in your last comment, building that business case, building the budget, and Melissa, I want to hear from you as well. That can be a big challenge. This is like a net incremental cost to the organization. It's in many ways, it's a new thing, hotline, training, third-party diligence platforms. Those have been known for many years. They've been in the budget lockdown as a standing thing for year over year, and this is a new thing that you're trying to add. So Keith, I'd love to turn to you because you all have gone through this more recently. How did your team think about and then execute building that business case internally to go in this new direction?
Well, that's a great question, and I don't know that we did it right, but we at least ended up being somewhat successful at it. So I'm assuming that's doing it right. One of the things to recognize is, boards and executives and all the decision makers, they've been using analytics in the primary space for years, whether it's, for us, it's delivering packages. For someone else, it's, making chocolate bars or whatever. And they've been, sales and marketing, they've been using analytics and data for years. So the whole concept of using analytics for compliance shouldn't be foreign to anyone. It's just, okay, taking what you've done in other contexts now and applying it in the compliance space. So that's helpful. At least you're speaking the same language at that point and just applying it to a different context. But for us, a lot of it was we started with the low-hanging fruit first. We tried to just show what was possible, give them sort of the art of the possible element to it, and say, look, here's what we were doing. Here's what we can do with just a little bit of investment, and see how much better this is, and see how much more informed you are now that you have this information, and see what kind of insights we can get. And we started with our hotline data. That was the easiest. I mean, we've got, 6 years with this one system of data that we had this treasure trove, and we said, all right, what kind of insights can we give the board out of this, so that when we come back to them with future requests for additional analytics, there'll be a context, there'll be a baseline that they'll know what we're talking about. And so we built out this dashboard, and it was relatively cheap, but it provided a lot of bang for the buck, so to speak. And so once you have that kind of baseline, it allows you then to move to more and more and more advanced analytics. You don't jump to the end right at the beginning. It's a nice little journey. It's not a marathon, a sprint. It's a marathon. And so my VP always says, don't boil the ocean. Don't let perfect get in the way of good. He uses both of those all the time. And that was really true when it came to us for building the business case, because we've then built upon that foundation every time we come back with more and more requests. And there's a context there that you've given to the decision makers, that they see the value in it. We're still a little bit removed from being able to show a true dollar return on investment yet. We're hoping that, actually, with once we get the transaction monitoring going with Lextegrity, and have done that for 6 months, 8 months, whatever, we'll be able to start putting true, dollar amounts with our business case. Right now, it's more about meeting expectations, doing the right thing. It's in line with our values. Here's the additional information you can get from analytics, those types of what I would call soft business case.
Got it. Great. And Melissa, how about you? I mean, it's been a couple of years since you've had to build that initial business case, but every year, you've got to re-up the budget. So kind of what approaches have you all taken?
I agree with what Keith said. Is if you start and become idealistic to have all of your infrastructure in place, it's going to take you a very long time to return those benefits for that investment to the company. So the approach we've taken is twofold. Is we started out with giving incremental benefits back, even with the basic things of what we were finding with analytics, back to the compliance monitoring and testing program, back to informing the compliance business partners, and then the metrics for the compliance department. We also looked at, if we were going to ask for additional investment, we wanted to make sure that we had already determined that we didn't have an in-house tool, approved tool, that could meet that need. And we found one example is using the tools you already have was in the analytics for monitoring communications with external. We had been using a third party for years. We then became a Microsoft shop, and we then focused on the Microsoft Purview communication compliance. And we built our routines in there where we can look at the interactions with our prospective employers and our reps and find, and this is already investments the company has made for the infrastructure, not for the compliance program. And we're looking at it for appropriate for our product communications and our antitrust policies. And when we see from our investigations substantiated cases, and we see that there have been areas where we could improve this monitoring, we're adding a new policy to that. And so again, that was zero investment. The other thing we did is when we build something, we started to bring together the business operations teams. So when we built the Latin America tenders program for analytics, we went to the operations people and we said, what would you like to review? If we're going to build it, what's going to benefit you? And so when we built it, we're now getting our needs met from a compliance standpoint, but also the operations team, they're looking at the data and they're using it for operations. And then what we do is we're having monthly meetings where we're actually not saying, well, here's a pretty analytics routine. We're actually having the analyst analyze the data, come back with the business and talk through swings that we're seeing. Some are false positives and some are we have to look more into. So that's been really helpful. We also have used it to, if we have an area where we want to drive down misconduct, we've used the analytics to build reports that are going to the business unit leaders on a monthly basis so that they can work on not having repeat offenders. And we have seen that the trend is going down when we're using the reports coming out of the analytics tools to get to the business to say, here's what's happening. There is misconduct in this area. And so that has proven very, very valuable. With that, when you bring those incremental benefits and then you have to ask for additional revenue, the leaders are more open to understand why that's necessary because you have already tried to use what you have and they're seeing the value.
That's great. And I think, and Tarek, I'm going to turn it over to you to get your thoughts on it. But I like both of you use kind of the metaphors and analogies of building blocks. You both talked about kind of doing these things incrementally and in phases, which we're big believers in as well. I think it can be almost paralyzing to think about a global implementation sometimes. I mean, depending on the size of your company, et cetera, and your reach, a global implementation may just seem, it's like you're going to open a Pandora's box. It's going to be very unsustainable and hard to manage. So going incrementally, having, phased approaches is really important. But I think one of the things that I think both of you have done really well, and what I know of your programs is being very mindful about what that long-term roadmap is and what each of those building blocks actually does. Because I've seen, we've definitely seen some companies that have, kind of just chased things as they come on, whether it's generative AI or, chatbots or something. You sit thinking like this is going to be, or just visualizing data. We've got Power BI. Let's just get the data in Power BI. And you spend a lot of effort chasing this one initiative that you think is going to provide a lot of value, and then it doesn't. And your foundation of your longer term roadmap is not as strong as kind of what you've both laid out, which is each step is building to something bigger and more useful and proves its value to your internal stakeholders who hold the budget strings. So with that, maybe Tarek, again, in your role as an advisor, I'd love to hear kind of how you advise small companies as well as larger companies on how they should think about their roadmap.
Yeah, and one of the things everybody said, start small and get bigger, and that's exactly what the DOJ did. A lot of these policies came out of their FCPA unit, and they focused on that first because almost everything they do involves a corporate investigation. Now they go throughout the government, and I think, but that shows companies how important it is to the Justice Department. This is going to be something in every corporate investigation now, whether it's FCPA, antitrust, fraud. It doesn't matter. But what you want to do is you want to focus on your risks. You want your program to be risk-based. Now, for some companies, especially smaller ones, you're going to want to try not to be seen as just a cost center. Obviously, saying here are the risks if we don't do this is going to be part of your business case. But the other part is going to be focused on the revenue and the savings. Try to just document and discuss the impact and the costs, but also the loss of revenue opportunities that a less advanced program can result in. For example, explain not just that, look, using our data will reduce our risks, but also, as we talked about earlier, you can bring in your third-party sales agents faster. You can get that deal done quicker. You can approve the business meals faster. And identify how the data use can add value to other parts of your business, like procurement and operations. You can streamline your procurement process, use fewer vendors, and also if something does go wrong, you can save money by having a faster, cheaper investigation. And just with your regular internal audit reviews, those can be done a lot faster and cheaper too. But again, also focus on the outcomes for companies that didn't do this. and you can point to the recent DOJ settlements, many of which have identified the company's improved data operations, and in some cases even saying it's why they didn't get a monitor.
Yeah, and there's actually a comment that came in the chat from one of the attendees about selling this effort as quote unquote, in this person's verbiage, buying integrity and moving the program and the integrity of the company forward rather than avoiding fines. And I think it really touches on all four of us today. You know, the downside risk, the enforcement action, the fines, et cetera, has really been a secondary point. Even Tarek, when you just spoke, you talked at length about all the different things you can do to benefit the company and benefit your third-party program investigations. And then it was as a secondary point, the kind of enforcement agency find that side of the equation. So I think that's spot on. It's a very good comment, and I think one that all three of us, I think, or all four of us would agree with. So one of, and I think the one other point I'd make is, as we've been working with companies that have put into place these advanced tools for 5-6 years now, and in my prior life, in a company we've done something similar. It becomes part of the plumbing of the compliance program, and I think this is continuous improvement, evolution of the practice of compliance, and I think the reality is that these things become part and parcel of having that compliance program, like a hotline, like training, like approval workflows and processes like that. And so, it really, the value becomes clearer and clearer as you use it, which is, again, a motivator for starting somewhere. So I think, we're about 2/3 of the way or more, 3/4 of the way through. I think we're going to jump a little bit into the tactics of acquiring data and the follow-on process. So once you've acquired the data and you're running analytics, what do you actually do with it, and how do you set up good governance around it? But I did want to just pause, ask folks to add any other questions that they might have into the question section, and we'll come back to that as they come in. So I'll kick off. I'm going to just kick off the data acquisition part, because I think we probably on the Lextegrity side have the most experience on this space of the speakers today. But really, and this could be its own webinar, so I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. But really, it's a process of capturing data, acquiring data, preparing it for the analysis, because you can't run analysis usually on just raw data coming in, and then making sure that data, then the data that you need for your analysis is actually complete and that it's mapped appropriately and consolidated. So it can seem like a gargantuan task, frankly, but if you break it into its constituent parts, it becomes much more manageable. So really, everything begins with that source data from those systems, like your T&E system or your ERP, your HR data. From our experience, typically the most effective way is to connect directly to that data source, using an API or standard reports from those systems or adapters that you have, and external partners often are very helpful in that space. Companies are moving more and more to having internal data lakes. We've seen some need to be a little cautious in terms of what your company's data lake might have. So they might have brought in SAP data, the IT team, or Oracle data or T&E data for another purpose. And when you go in from a compliance perspective, that data is incomplete. You've got to go back to the data lake team, get more data, and that can kind of go on for a long time. So acquiring data, you need to be pretty thoughtful about how you do it, but that's the first step in the process. Then there's the preparing that data, and what I mean there is the data that you need for an analysis might come from joining 3 different data sources, data points from 3 different tables in SAP or Oracle. So you need to have some technical expertise, some forensic expertise, some IT expertise to figure those things out. And then there's mapping and consolidation, which I'll touch on really quickly, which is the point that your data in your source systems may have multiple categorizations that can water down the data if you leave them intact. So you might have 10 different airfare categories: domestic airfare, international airfare, et cetera. You may want to map those into one airfare category for your analytics engine. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Melissa and Keith, who are have been knee deep in this within their organization. So talk a little bit about their experiences with data readiness, completeness mapping, what kind of internal resources that they needed to make that a success. So I don't know, Melissa, if you want to start.
Well, when you set your budget and your plan, you should probably times it by 8. Because finding the right people in your organization that understand the data, understand the connectors that you have available to your company, understand the data, understand what you want to do with the data is not always an easy task. And so I think set those expectations early so that you're not disappointed. We do use our corporate analytics team, and we use the data they've built, their data lakes or warehouses. We do have to look at them, like you said, Parth, and really build, let's say, a prototype, a test. That's what we found to say, is this going to work? Are we seeing all false positives? Does it have the data we need? Is it coming from the right systems? Are we interpreting it the right way? And so we have found that when we build that kind of prototype, and then we have individuals that are very knowledgeable about our business actually testing it, we have then been able to come up with the right requirements to build internally. Externally, going with a partner, I think having a clear understanding of what's needed for the implementation is necessary at the very beginning. It's not easy, and sometimes you don't ask all the questions, and then you get surprises along the way, which then turns into a delay on both sides. So really understand the end-to-end net needs from both ends, so that you've asked the questions in the beginning and you've gathered and found the right people at both organizations.
Right.
Yeah, I completely echo that. I might say instead of multiply it by 8, maybe by 10 or 12, at least the plan, maybe not the budget, but the plan, because that's the nightmare that I'm currently living. And one thing, even before the validation, the acquisition is if you're a smaller entity, that part may not be as difficult. But when you're a global entity the size of FedEx or Olympus or some of these other companies, just knowing what data you have, what is available and where it is and who owns it, that's a huge part of the problem sometimes. So that's where partnering with our internal audit group has been invaluable for us, because they have the keys to every kingdom because they're internal audit. And so they can help us say, oh, that is so-and-so, that is over here, we have this, is this. And they may not be able to get us access to it, but they know what the data is, where to go, who to contact, those types of things. And that can be really invaluable as partnering with those, whether it's internal audit or a corporate analytics group, if you have one, partnering with that other group. The mapping and validation with respect to the transaction monitoring, FedEx consolidated several ERP systems that we had globally into one. And so when we partnered with Lextegrity, I was thinking, great, we only have one ERP. It should be really easy, 6 months max, and we're still struggling. And it has nothing to do with Lextegrity, but we're just still struggling with some of that mapping and validation of some of the items out of our ERP and getting it over. And part of that is it was my own failure to recognize or anticipate that the team that owns the ERP also has 9,000 projects that they're working on. And so their time to devote to one project that I'm working on is very limited. And so I didn't have that conversation on the front end with them of, how much time IT or how much time, corporate analytics team do you have that you can devote to this project? Because I've got all the time in the world. It's a very important project to me. I'm one of many competing priorities that they have to deal with. And so you have to keep that in mind when you're building out your plan on how long something should take is, other internal partners that you're going to have to rely on. They may have limited resources. They may have limited budget. You may have all the budget in the world to contract with the vendor, but if they have to work with an outside vendor of their own to get the data, then that you have to take into account their budget for that. So those are things that I'm learning, but I'm learning it the hard way, but it'll only take one time learning it.
No, Keith, appreciate that. And maybe as Melissa, just turning it back to you as we think about resources further along in the journey, once you've set it up, your analytics program up, the governance of that program, the documentation and follow-up still needs human beings. Kind of how have you managed that setup process?
So we definitely, for anything we build in-house, we have, when you come in, you get a dashboard page that talks about the source systems that are used, how often the data is updated, when was the last time the data was updated, the purpose of what it's doing, and then where are the outputs, because we want to make sure that we do have that continuity. If the analyst rolls on to another job, anyone using this information can self-serve themselves. We have a maintenance schedule where we've been able to leverage really our internal IT resources and our data analytics team's resources, the corporate team, to say, if we want to make this something that is updated based on a job schedule every day, how do we do it? And we have had success without having to take a lot of IT's time. We may need some advice, but we've been able to do it with the permissions and the accounts that we have. And so that is very helpful because we're able to maintain it. And every month, someone doesn't have this job of updating the data. And anytime someone in the department wants to see the updated, or the business wants to see the analytics, they're usually updated the night before or the prior week. We've also then, we're still asked the question, are we getting value out of the analytics? Are we getting value out of the detection activities that we're doing versus the prevention activities? And so we're very aware that what we're really trying to do is we're trying to eliminate violations, and we're trying to change behavior. And so we've used the analytics too to correlate things we're doing to prevent violations, like monitoring, testing, training and communication and policies and advice, correlated with the monitoring and the testing outcomes coming out of analytics, so that we can see, are we putting the right changes in place? Are they making an impact? And so we correlate them with the use of analytics, and then we go back and we say, what worked, what didn't, where do we have some additional work to do? But we're also looking at it when you're looking at the team and the budget of the team. Are we spending too much human resources on detection versus prevention? And so we're looking at that too. And we've also started to use this too, from a maintenance standpoint. Something recently is, let's not always look for the negative. Let's mine this data to see who's doing it right. Where are those positives? Who doesn't? Who's successful and has no violations? And so I think from a governance standpoint, that's kind of what we're feeding back to the group, and that's how we're maintaining it.
That's great.
And that last point that Missy mentioned about, who's doing it right, that feeds into something else the government's focused on recently, which is ensuring that companies use compliance as a metric for their reviews. So, I mean, these sort of these data analytics uses can have multiple other benefits too.
And Tarek, just maybe the final question that I always love to ask former government folks is, one of the, as I think Melissa and Keith have laid out, there's human judgments and decisions that need to be made throughout the whole process of setting up a program, in terms of what tool to even use, what analytics to set up, and then how you actually follow up on these analytics. And there's a fear among some that if you ever do end up in front of an enforcement agency, they're going to second guess each one of those decisions. What did you do with the output? Why did you set up the analytics this way? Why didn't you look at this transaction and looked at that transaction? And that can be just completely paralyzing, right? So how do you think about that question, when you're advising a client who's thinking about making the leap into this?
Yeah.
Space?
So one of the things is, I say, look, here's how I think the government's going to look at it. Look, in that respect, they are going to second guess it. They look at it as that's part of their job. The fraud section now has a new unit that focuses only on compliance. But if they see that you've actually thought through the issues, identified the risks, and you can explain, here's why we did this and not that, they are willing to listen. Now, ultimately, they may not agree with you, but they are listening. They are focusing a lot more now on your process. And this is an increasingly important area to them. The two recent times that I've been in front of them on the compliance program issue, at the end of every investigation, you have a presentation on the company's compliance program. You explain where it was when the alleged misconduct occurred, what changes you made, and where it is today. The data analysis has been a very major focus for them. And the two times recently that I've been in front of them, very different companies, one very large, one very small. The very large company had an internally made, very complicated AI-based system, but they're a huge company with a lot of risks. The other company, they were doing things like what Keith and Missy mentioned in the beginning. They're fewer than 100 employees. They're using Excel spreadsheets, and the government recognizes that a company like that doesn't need to have the sort of all the bells and whistles that the big companies had, but they need to identify the issue, think it through, and create a system to address it.
Got it. No, it makes a ton of sense. I know we have about 2 more minutes. There are a couple of questions that I thought we could get to. There was one question about AI, the use of AI, what the positive, viable use cases, plus and minuses are here. I can jump in, and one of you feel free to jump in there. So from my perspective, I think that there's all different ways to tackle AI. There's unsupervised machine learning, there's supervised machine learning, there's various approaches. I think the concept of taking transactional data and putting it through more of an unsupervised model where we're just going to feed a system transactions and it's going to flag for us what we think is what is high risk. I think there are some significant challenges with that because the training data for your specific company and your specific patterns of behavior may be very different than another company. So, having a strong baseline analytics model and then using more supervised machine learning on the back end of that, learning as you're training your model with your data, you're clearing transactions, you're saying this one's risky, this one's not risky, this one's risky because of this. Find me more of these transactions over time, enhance the risk scores of other transactions, give me feedback on how I should change my settings and analytics engine is probably the best place to start with your AI models. I think there's a lot of hype in this space, but I think there are clear use cases that we're using and others are using that can provide pretty immediate value, or immediate after a couple of months of training your data. I think there's been talk of kind of like shared models between organizations where you're using anonymized data and you're feeding in your transactions to some sort of shared model. I think just from in MIT has been kind of at the forefront of that, a research project there. I think the numbers there, in terms of accuracy of the model are really lackluster. In terms of the baseline accuracy was pretty low, and then it improved by slightly a little bit more, but so still a very low accuracy rate, where our accuracy rates using a model with much stronger analytics at its baseline that are really customized to the company are way higher. So I think this could be its own separate topic. I'm happy to engage with folks. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that.
Bart, that's one of the reasons that we were drawn to this particular system, is that FedEx's risk profile may be very different than Exxon's, which may be very different than some other company, and so forth. And we wanted to be able to say, all right, let's identify those that are the riskiest transactions to us, not to just general industry or general companies, but where are our riskiest transactions according to our own risk profile. So.
Yeah, you don't want to use the lowest common denominator of kind of analytics on your data. So I know we're at time. There are a couple more questions we didn't get to. We'll try to reach out, back out with some consolidated responses on those. But thank you all. Thank you, Melissa, Tara, Keith, for your time here, your insightful comments. We tried to pack in a lot. I hope everyone got some good nuggets of information about how to have really impactful data analytics. I think I can speak for everyone, hopefully, that we would all love to connect with any of you on LinkedIn or other formats, see you at conferences and tell you more about our experiences. And thank you all for attending, and look forward to connecting with you all soon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.